We're continuing our series of tutorial videos to assist you in interpreting laboratory results from Precision Analytical. So in this session, we're going to be discussing the advanced adrenal assessment. So we're looking at cortisol and cortisone values along with their metabolites and DHEAS. So you can see the individual values on this page along with the reference range, and then when we move to the graphical representation on the following page, then you're going to get a little bit more information along with the results. We're going to have in the upper part here, as you can see, kind of a tutorial for you to assist your patient in understanding, what exactly goes on when you have stress, and you're stimulating the brain to make a series of hormones, which stimulate the pituitary, so we're still in the brain there, to make ACTH. And ACTH, of course, is then going to get released into the bloodstream, and when that hits your adrenal glands, which of course sit on top of your kidney, then you're going to make a series of hormones, which includes DHEA, DHEAS, and of course cortisol. So the cortisol value you can see here in this particular patient is elevated, as is the DHEAS, and this cortisol value is not an actual measured value, but it's a calculated value from the 4 individual points that are made. So you may have a patient who is, as in this case, elevated at all 4 points, where the HPA axis is pretty severely stimulated throughout the day, and of course that's going to result in, when you integrate the area under that curve, you're going to get an elevated value for your daily total of cortisol. And so then we're going to continue on to look at some of the metabolism pictures of cortisol, and not just the free cortisol, which brings us a little bit extra information as we move along. So what we want to look at is what happens when cortisol is increased. So when we have an acute stressor, of course cortisol is going to increase, and if cortisol increases and we have healthy metabolism, then we're also going to get increased levels of total cortisol metabolites as well as DHEAS. And this is not necessarily unhealthy. When you're stressed, these levels go up, and then when the stressor is gone, then the levels are going to return to baseline, and that's normal, healthy function. But what we find is when there's increased stress that becomes chronic, then we start to influence some of these other parameters in here, so the body's going to start to metabolize that cortisol in a way that's going to get rid of some of it so that you can decrease that excess cortisol. So oftentimes we'll start to see a preference for cortisone, which is the inactive form of cortisol, to again try to rid the body of that excess cortisol. As well, you'll see cortisone and cortisol metabolism increase to try to clear some of that excess cortisol, and then you end up with a pattern where the cortisol metabolites are actually elevated to a greater degree than is cortisol as your body begins processing this chronically elevated cortisol. And as this happens time after time over an extended period of time, then you can end up getting a situation like this, where your free cortisol has actually become depressed, not necessarily because your adrenal glands aren't producing enough, but because those metabolism rates, cortisone and cortisol, have become quite elevated. So in this case, the body's really doing everything it can to move all that excess cortisol away from cortisol to the inactive forms and to these metabolites of cortisol. But you can see that we still have a lot of cortisol metabolites in a case like this. So if you're only looking at free cortisol, you're not getting the whole picture for a patient like this. So as this continues, then oftentimes the cortisol metabolites will as well begin to come down, and then you end up in a situation where the patient truly is adrenally insufficient, where not only are they not making active free cortisol, but there are no cortisol metabolites much to speak of as well. So in this case, this person truly is not producing enough cortisol. But we want to be able to differentiate between the patients who are not making enough cortisol and situations where the metabolism has simply been upregulated, which we can see in obesity, hyperthyroidism, and long-term stress, where you're just exposed to cortisol so much that the body responds by, again, metabolizing that. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece that we want to look at is, again, these individual data points from different parts of the day, because we can see not only dysfunction in the metabolism and dysfunction in the amount of cortisol, but also the time of cortisol as far as when it's made. So in a case like this, where you've got somebody who's just not making very much cortisol, you may end up getting some fatigue that's related to those deficient cortisol levels. When you see a pattern more like this, you may end up seeing fatigue in the earlier parts of the day, but as we get to the nighttime, you may end up having sleepless nights because of the elevated cortisol. But what we can see additionally with this is when you test this person over a 24-hour period, because they're low during one part of the day and elevated during another part of the day, their 24-hour value may well be perfectly normal even if they have severe cortisol dysfunction. And so that's why it's important that we look at the diurnal pattern. So this is an example of somebody whose HPA axis is throughout the day just chronically revved up, and they're making a lot of cortisol, and of course there are going to be some symptoms that go along with that, which can lead to depression, anxiety, and other things that relate to elevated cortisol. And so we really want to make sure that we're treating those patients well to try to get that under control. And so for the advanced adrenal assessment, then we want to be looking at all of these parameters: the amount of cortisol we're making, when exactly that cortisol is made, and then what the body's doing with the cortisol, as well as the DHEA-S. And so this should give you a very good profile of the patient's adrenal health, and we think you'll find that very useful in treating patients with fatigue and other things that are related to adrenal hormones. So patients, if you have questions about any of these with specifics to your own results, then go ahead and just contact your healthcare provider and they can help you work through those. And we hope you'll also check out our other educational videos on more specific topics for the other hormone profiles that we're looking at in our hormone testing.